Start with the next session. We're starting with the next session, which is on trade, investment, and the multilateral process with a global order. To chair this session, we have with us Anwarul Hoda, who's the chair professor of ICRIER's Trade Policy and WTO Research Program at ICRIER. Unfortunately, the Commerce Secretary, Anup Vadhavan, is not with us, but he's nominated the Joint Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India, Mr. Damu Ravi. We have Mr. Manoj Pant, who's the Director, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and Amartya Lahiri, who's the Director, Center for Advanced Financial Research and Learning. Over to the chair.
May I call the meeting to order? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let us begin. We are already late. I would not like to preempt the distinguished panelists by giving my views on various subjects, various topics that are engaging our attention on trade. But I may like to ask the panelists some questions which they could endeavor to answer, besides, of course, saying whatever else they want to and for which they have made the preparations. The last 2 years, actually we are reviewing only the last 1 year, but the last 2 years have been rather extraordinary in the trading world. While growth in the volume has continued to be strong, the outlook has turned gloomy. You must all have heard about the statement made by Christine Lagarde of the IMF about what may happen if the trends continue. We all know that the international trade scene has been disturbed by aggressive trade action taken by the United States in an attempt to correct trade imbalances with their main trading partners. But we also know that with 3 of them, the trading partners of the United States, an agreement has been reached with Korea, with Mexico, and Canada. With the EU, the European Union, there's an uneasy pause as the two sides seem to have agreed on negotiations, but the negotiations themselves have not started. They are not actually taking place. In the meantime, tariff action by the United States on steel and aluminum on security grounds and the retaliatory action taken by the European Union stay in place. The US has threatened imposition of tariffs on auto products also, and the EU has warned of retaliation. Thus, the US and EU began a trade war, no doubt, but there seems to be some sort of an uneasy armistice between them. The US has also opened another front lately and demanded that Japan enter into negotiations for a bilateral trade deal. The US and China, however, are fully engaged in a trade war, and no talks are taking place. In this troubled situation, let me pose a question to the panelists. Where do you think the world is heading? Will there be a denouement soon? A climax followed by some sort of a peace accord, as in the case of Canada, Mexico, and South Korea? Or will the war continue despite internal pressures that are being created in the United States itself against the disruptions that is being caused for the supply chains, global and regional? Well, I do not expect you to do crystal ball gazing, but using reason, perhaps, you may come to some conclusion. That was my first question. The second relates to another development. Again, the United States is the main agent for this development. We all know that the stalemate in pushing forward with further liberalization of trade has whittled down the eminence of the WTO as an international institution. But there is a widely shared assessment that in this period, the WTO has been held aloft by the success of the dispute settlement mechanism. But this mechanism is facing an existential threat by the actions of the United States, which has been vetoing appointments to the appellate body. There was first 1, then 2, then 3, now 4 vacancies out of a total of 7. The US has some concerns, some of which are important, and some that are procedural and can be easily dealt with. The important aspect is that the US is linking these issues to the filling up of vacancies and not discussing the resolution of these issues. What is the secret agenda behind this approach? Is it to dismantle the dispute settlement system, the quasi-judicial machinery for the dispute settlement, and revert to the GATT days when the dispute settlement process could be easily blocked. If this happens, that is, we revert to the olden days, the implication will be that the strengthening of the multilateral trade system achieved during the Uruguay round will be nullified. And this is my second question. What do the panelists think of the likely future course of action on this? Is a weakening of the dispute settlement machinery of the WTO inevitable? This is the second question. I think I'll stop with these questions. I had others also, but I have taken a lot of time already. I'll now hand over the floor to the three panelists. As you have been advised, you have 20 minutes each. And after you have spoken, we will throw open the floor, and then I'll conclude. So let us start with the first panelist, and I invite Dr. Pant, Manoj Pant, to be the first.
Thank you, Mr. Huda. Now you put me in a quandary because your questions are more interesting, but I had prepared something on G20. Because I thought this is a conference in G20 and where G20 is going. So you tell me, I can speak extempore on that or speak on this. You take a choice. Now,
you have the option. You could perhaps start with what you have prepared.
well, that doesn't lead to what you asked, so it doesn't help. But anyway, I think your questions are far, as far as I can make out. There are three things you're asking, that where are we headed as far as the world global order is concerned. Secondly, trade disruption and Trump. And third is Trump and WTO, specifically dispute settlement. So, should I speak on this?
No, please, as you please.
Oh, okay.
Go by your
How much time do I have?
20 minutes.
Oh, 20 minutes. Okay. So I'll quickly rush through what I prepared. Now, I'll try to address some of the issues in the context of this, although that wasn't what I came here for. Now, if you look at the G20, what is the structure? Everyone knows. Basically, the OECD, rest of EU, BRICS, and some others, right? Now, so that structure matters. Now, here's a whole lot of stuff which someone wrote down for me as to when they were established. But look at by and large, what is the most important logic of G20? And you've got to go slightly further back to this. Typically, every world economic disruption or slowdown is followed by creation of institutions. The first, of course, structures came up after the First World War. Then we had the recession of the 30s and the Second World War. And then we had the Bretton Woods conference. We had the World Bank, IMF, and the beginnings of a WTO, it's important, called the GATT. Now, after that, nothing really happens except for political groupings for a long time, till the 90s when the world was again disrupted by political changes. And then now we come to this two sort of recessionary periods. One was 97, which was the East Asian crisis. Now, why was that disruptory? Because from what people were seeing in the world trade, and if you look at trade, it grew enormously between 1950 and 1970 or so. GATT was actually extremely successful for lots of reasons. And once again, from 1980, there has been a fairly high rate of growth of world trade, except for the disruption in East Asian economies during the late 90s. So the question was, why is this happening? I mean, everything's been going so well. Why this sudden aberration in the 90s? And that was part of the reason that I believe the G20 came up. This is the new grouping that came up after the Second World War, which said, look, we need one more group of nations to sort of look at now what's gone wrong. Things have been going so well since 1950 or so, at the economic front. Now, the problem that arises is in 2008. And let me mention that. Contrary to what the IMF and the World Bank have been occasionally putting out, actually we have been in a recession now for the last 10 years. In the sense that if not for the US economy growing, and maybe some growths here and there, China of course, there is no growth in the world at all, anywhere. Some of this is linked to growth theories, and I don't want to get into the economics part at the moment. But by and large, we know that, for example, trade to GDP ratio has been stuck at about 60% since 2008 till today, not changing. And every year, the WTO and the IMF bring out their forecasts. Every forecast is wrong. The 2016 forecast was 3%, was actual 1.3%. The 2016-17 forecast was about 3 point something percent, actual is 1.1%. Of course, no one is absolutely right in forecasting. Everyone is under forecasting, and no one seems to know why. Now, if I go into the economics of that, then that becomes a completely different ballgame. So let me stick right now to this G20. I believe G20 came up and became especially important after 2008 because people couldn't figure out why are we not moving. We're doing everything that is right by the textbooks in terms of economics. And the first thing you can see, I think it's here somewhere, the feeling was that the 2008 crisis was a financial crisis. Unlike the 1930s where people thought it was a real crisis, which is of course completely wrong. Because the 2008 crisis also caused by a real crisis, but the focus was on the financial instruments, the fact that people created these new financial instruments called derivatives, and that made the market crash in the US and spread to the world. So the whole objective of G20 was, therefore, let's look at the deteriorating financial market conditions and resist trade protectionism. Now, the role is important. If you remember, in 2008, the USA and China pumped in roughly little over $3 trillion into the world economy in terms of pump priming. Keynes called it pump priming. India also did something its own way, own small way. I think it was Mr. Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister. I think so, I'm not certain. Anyway, they also did a lot of excise duty cuts. They had this pay commission, which also came in around the same time, and so people thought things would improve. Now, the problem that has arisen since 2008 is every year, they now meet every year. And I was looking at history. Again, let me remind you, I am not a G20 observer, please. I am also reading from here about G20. But if you look, they're meeting every year after that. Because no one can seem to figure out what's going wrong. We are doing all the right things. We are cooperating. Yet, the world economy is not sort of moving ahead. So the G20 is the new grouping, which is supposed to do what many of the early institutions could not do could not sort of broke down after the 90s crisis and the 2008 crisis. Now, they're very important. There's some data which is here. This data very clearly, don't worry about the broad numbers. The broad numbers clearly say that the G20 is actually almost the world. They constitute about 86% of world GDP, about 7% of the population, that's very important, and more than 75% of the global trade in merchandise and trade stuff. So it is the world. And the G20 can get its act together, frankly, the world technically should be able to get out of its crisis. Now, one of the things, I'm not going to show you a lot of graphs. This is the problem of having good RAs. They give you too much information. And this RA who made this extremely good. Anyway, I'll just mention a few things. Just look at the second graph on the, this, let's say, how do you point to these things? That second one, top right hand. Those are the share graphs. Now, what this graph tells you is, you take the G20 countries, how much are they exporting to other G20 countries? Each G20, intra-G20 trade. And then you see the G20 countries, how much they're exporting to the world. And this share G20 exports to the rest of the world to each other, divide by G20 countries exports to the world. It's like how much of the trade is intra G20, how much is external. And you can see it's been fairly constant. You can see the top two lines, blue line. But you see the line which is going down, and that's what I want to point out here. There are a lot of graphs to prove it. The other line is the inward FDI. You see, in economics, till today, trade is something that those serious guys discuss and you get Nobel Prizes for. But investment is something that the business guys talk about, in business school, organization. But if you look at the reality, both are really two sides of the same coin. There is no difference between trade and FDI. FDI is just one more way of doing trade. Trade is commodities, services. But FDI is a combination of commodities, services, managerial. Difference is trade is supposed to be conducted between independent countries, and by definition, FDI is not between independent countries, it's between similar firms. Now, here notice that the share of G20 in terms of world FDI is declining, but the rest remain the same. That means for some reason, the FDI trends in the G20 are not keeping up with the FDI trend. And I'm going to come back to that a little later so I can try and address your questions. I have a whole lot of graphs here, not hundreds, but quite a few graphs. I do this for every country. I look at OECD, I look at then the BRICS as part of G20. So I looked at the G20 total, looked at OECD, looked at BRICS as part of OECD, as part of G20, and of course the other G20. And I do the same thing for all of them. And you get, you can do that for exports, you can do it for imports. And I'm looking at these two things: trade, either exports or imports, and FDI. And one of the things that you have, which believe me is true, is that these two tend to move together, by and large. By and large, I am not talking about causality. There's no causality here. Just that, as I say, these are two sides of the same coin. And trade and FDI do move together. And what I'm going to try to argue, or at least I think I will argue here, is that that is the problem. That most countries' FDI policies are divorced from their trade policies. Let me put it the other way around. You cannot say let's trade more but let's have a restrictive FDI policy. It doesn't make sense. And I think something you mentioned already points to the supply chain. Supply chain is what but FDI? So in the world today, when the structure of trade has changed from normal manufactured goods, services, of one good being two, trade in homogeneous goods, that's not true anymore. Today all trade is intra-firm trade in parts and components. So it's basically everyone making one thing which is sold somewhere, and I'll address the China thing after that. No one's really making anything. Everyone's making something, it's put together wherever it is to be sold. That's how the world actually trade works. So I'm showing that this shows the same thing, that where countries are not, where foreign direct investment is not following the same path as trade, one of the two is trade is not going to take place. And that's the only thing I want to make. I'll come back to that. Now, what about the G20? Now, what did happens with the G20, which said that they were very careful and said, let's watch financial liberalization, but also let's make sure that there were not too many protective measures. Now, let me mention, before this Trump phenomena came into the business, if you look at the WTO side, I don't have it here, till 2016, surprisingly, very few tariff restrictive measures were taken by countries. Please notice, in 2008, world GDP actually fell by 1% before it came back to normal. Yet no country brought in tariff measures. So those who say that the WTO is a dead duck, not entirely right. It has some influence still. It's only recently because of Trump that things are happening. But what did happen? Because in a recession, and we have been in a recession for the last 10 years, every country has been. In a recession, political economy requires that you have to have some response. The response has been what also happened historically earlier in the 80s, everyone's responding with non-tariff measures. And that's really what you'll see There is if you look at the last one, trade remedy measures initiations were greater than trade remedy terminations. So new initiations on trade remedy measures. And those who are WTO people will know trade remedy measures mainly mean protective measures. There were some new initiations, some were terminations. The initiations were larger than the terminations. And you can see the standard areas: iron and steel, plastics, vehicles, parts, accessories, etc. Products of iron and steel. Now, decrease in the number of anti-dumping investigations in this period, about 34, 20, 10, 20 years. But countervailing duty, SPS, sanitary, phytosanitary measures, TBT, technical barriers to trade, these remained high. So we see the old story coming that although tariff for some reasons people are not using, but they are using what are called non-tariff measures. Now, last two slides, and I'll come quickly to your. I have about 5 minutes more. How much? 5 minutes?
Actually, you have only 2 minutes more.
Oh, 2 minutes. My God, we're working on different standard times. Okay, quickly. I'll just tell you the first slide. The other doesn't matter. This is not my slide. It's a trade monitoring report of the WTO. What it says is these very nice cobweb diagrams, actually quite explanatory. The closer you are to the corners, the closer you are to the ideal, which is really, let's say, free trade or free. You know, 0 is open country and 1 is free, trade. 0 least open country, 1 is free trade. The corners of these are the open country, and you can see that. Whereas in some areas, non-automatic licensing, some of the countries seem to be moving there, but most other cases, everyone is in all these various policy measures well within. So as far as using non-tariff measures to restrict trade, or to prevent non-tariff measures from restricting trade, that the G20 hasn't been too successful. And that's, I think, all I wanted to say on this. Now let me take my last, this same thing it says, and so forth. So my question is this. 2 points I'm making. One point I'm making is that the G20 was never viewed, as far as I'm aware, as an economic instrument. It was a political instrument. It was an instrument meant to make countries come together and talk, because we've got this new crisis in 97 and the most serious crisis of 2008. You bring in India, China, and the developing countries because for some reason they are also important now. But they haven't really worked in terms of preventing protection. They've been working in their own little areas, in their own silos. The US silo one side, the EU silo on the other side. The most failed instrument has been BRICS. If you look at BRICS, barring India, Russia, no two countries are trading with each other. BRICS survived for a while because everyone's exporting to China when the Olympics came 2008. After 2008, all trade disappears. In particular, if you look at the pattern of investment, which is what I'm trying to focus, it's all these countries of BRICS have invested everywhere but in other BRIC countries. China in Africa, India, UK and US, South Africa in the African continent. None of these countries, Soviet Union in their old Soviet bloc, Eastern European countries, none of them invest in other BRICS countries. So what the point I'm trying to make is, the thing that has happened, and let me quickly address, okay, maybe I'll answer more questions. My point is this: I believe that trade and investment, unless they move together, you will not get any further improvement in world economy, and I don't see it happening in the near future. Now, let me quickly address the last issue, the Trump business. This is not a Trump and China war. It's such a mistake, I think the ministry also feels that we could probably get and make a lot of things which China now will not be able to buy from USA. Maybe we can sell to them. Problem is that trade with China was not only a China-US trade. It was a trade of the whole of Asia with China. If you look at the Brookings report of 2008 and you look at another study in 2012, what did it show you? It says of China's exports to these countries, mainly the US and OECD, less than 5 or 6% is value added in China. 95% goes to buy the inputs which come from South Korea, from Japan, from whole of East Asia. Notice, till recently, all South Asian countries except the Indian subcontinent had a trade surplus with China, all of them. You take Hong Kong, Singapore, you name them, Malaysia. The reason is they're all exporting something to China. China becomes the assembly line, what you call supply chain, and they export to the West. So the issue is not what China will do. The issue is what will the rest do? What is Japan going to do? If the only place they're going to sell is not only China's problem, although it's a politically China's problem, but in terms of economics, it's not only China's problem. So issue is not just what China will do. And in a sense, I always believe there is sometimes method in madness. And you take a person like Trump, maybe there's a method. He's a businessman. What he doesn't understand is, why do I only keep buying? Why don't I sell? Right? Every business thinks, that's what he's saying. Why can't I sell? And of course, he doesn't know why he can't sell. The American people will tell him why he can't sell. But the fact remains that his issue is China, because that's what is visible. Your trade data shows China's surplus with the US, but it isn't China's surplus with the US. Last point, quickly address, regarding your point about WTO. But this was nothing new. If you recall in the 1940s, when the GATT was set up, which was only a non-mandatory agreement, there was an attempt to set up an ITO. But the US shot it down because the US could control anyway. In the 1940s, all the countries most countries did not exist as independent. The ones that were devastated after the World War, they knew that the Marshall Plan meant everyone's going to buy from the US. So it didn't matter. The one who sells controls, the one who makes controls. And so the Americans knew that in any case they could control who would give what tariff concessions. You want to sell in US? Okay, you cut tariffs. In fact, you go back to the history, in the early 50s after GATT, the US gave far more tariff concessions to the world than the world did. Because they wanted to end imperial preferences. They wanted to convince people that, okay, this nuclear war is over, atom bomb is gone, all that story is gone, let's bring Japan back into world trade, lots of these things. But, so, do they want to hijack the dispute settlement? I don't think so. They don't recognize the dispute settlement. I don't even think Trump is aware that there's one guy that they are not allowing anyone to pick. So it's not as if they want to actually sabotage WTO. They've never believed the WTO actually works. And tragedy is that the other big country which people expected something of in the 90s also doesn't believe the WTO means anything but the US, China. China has always been a great fan of the US running the world trade because that's how trade works. So as far as I'm concerned, I could stop here and say, look, is the prognosis good? Not at all. I don't see anything improving, and I believe personally, and that's a separate paper by itself, I believe the next crisis will start from the financial sector. And that's where where G20 monitoring can be very useful. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pant.
The
next speaker is Amartya Lahiri.
Okay. So let me just start by thanking Rajat for this very kind invitation. I think by some fortuitous chance, I structured my stuff because I know very little about the G20, but I think, I know a little about trade, but I know a little bit more. So my whole thing was on trade, so I think I might somehow, asymptote towards the question you'd asked. So I guess the way I want to organize this, the 20 minutes is clearly global trade and the investment regime that has been, governing the international investment regime and international, exchanges between countries. That whole regime is under threat. There is no confusion about that. However, this pushback is not necessarily new. I mean, we've had this pushback from various interest groups. It used to be essentially leftist groups, historically, globally, those were the guys who were pushing back. It just has now become joined by establishment forces in developed countries, which has given this a slightly different hue. So we are clearly on a cusp where we go from here is somewhat uncertain, but I'm going to hazard a few guesses as to where we are going. But before I do that, I think I just want to say, flagged for, maybe this is all sort of, common knowledge maybe, but it's sort of useful to phrase the debate before we get into it, is what exactly is at stake here? And I think there's a lot at stake. So I want to start with that as to what exactly is at stake. How big is the risk of unraveling of the whole system? That's like a second key component of what I would like to talk about. And then lastly, I just want to talk about, could this be, in some strange way, an opportunity for India? If, how might this impact us? So those are the three broad things I'm going to talk about. So what is the stake? It turns out trade and growth go hand in hand, and that's been known for a long time. Since 1960, for example, the world has grown at about 3.5% to 4%. World GDP has grown at that rate, and imports during the same time have grown at basically double the speed. The causation, of course, is unclear, and so this is, a lot of people debate which direction are imports causing growth, or is growth causing imports, and but the association is unambiguous. The Indian evidence on this is also very striking. I mean, growth picked up very sharply post-1992, and during that period, there has been a 30 percentage point fall in poverty rate since 1992. So it does have first-order effects. I mean, this is not... growth does impact a bunch of social markers, socioeconomic markers. And so this is something that is important. Moreover, there is this other part of trade that is also known but not maybe as clearly appreciated. If you look at cross-country income differences, which are huge, the gap between the richest and the poorest countries is a factor of, about, if you take the top 5% and the bottom 5% of the world in terms of countries, the gap is about 50-fold in terms of per capita incomes. That is huge. Now you try to decompose that gap into what comes from measured inputs versus what comes from unmeasured stuff. It turns out over 50% comes from unmeasured inputs. What is unmeasured? What are unmeasured inputs? That's essentially productivity. That's what we refer to typically as productivity. And it turns out it's a major component of cross-country income differences. And so it's the secret sauce. There's there is a huge amount of work that tries to figure out what are the sources of productivity differences, what sparks productivity growth. And so that is something that, there is no consensus. A lot of people think of a bunch of different things. It could be institutions, it could be trading regimes, it could be the legal structure, it could be the technology you're using. But amongst all of that, there is a conjecture that trade might have something to do with it in terms of the way we trade. Trade is, in the very classical way of thinking of trade is just importing in the best way of doing stuff. I mean, you just import in the best method of production. Whoever has the best method has the comparative advantage. So that's, in some sense, the oldest possible way of thinking of trade. So potentially there is this first-order link between trade and productivity. Of course, the issue is that it gets very hard to nail down the line of causation. So for example, I mean, if you just look at who exports in India, just at the level of establishments. So, I mean, here are, I'm going to show you two pictures. I mean, typically exporting versus non-exporting establishments in India. These are not firms, but these are establishments. And, the right panel is showing revenues. This is just a measure of size, if you will. And it's clear that all the, skyscrapers in the right panel are taller than the bars in the left panel. And what do you take away from that? It just says that firms that export tend to be larger. Now, this is, of course, in the landscape of Indian firms, who are all small in an absolute sense, mostly. But even within them, there is a clear difference between the guys who export versus the guys who don't. Now, why does size matter? Well, it turns out a lot of the time we do think that, there is a lot of evidence that size is correlated with productivity. That somehow the bigger guys are able to reap some economies of scale, maybe. There are productivity gains which kick in at a higher scale. And so there is that conjecture. And indeed, you look at the same picture now for the same set of firms, you start examining their productivity. This is just, productivity of non-exporting firms on the left panel, productivity of the exporting firms on the right panel. And you see exactly the same feature, pretty much, except for the couple of years in the middle when there was this big slowdown. Other than that, what you see is that exporting firms tend to be more productive in India, on average. So they tend to be larger, and that tends to get correlated with higher productivity. So remember this big picture thing that I was talking about earlier, that a big component of income differences is productivity. Trade seems to go hand in hand with income growth, and trade also tends to go hand in hand with productivity growth. So there is this big first-order link in some sense. This, of course, doesn't say much about why is it the case that the exporting firms are more productive. It could well be that people who are somehow better select into exporting. So there's a huge selection issue. Who exports? I might not select into being an exporter because I just don't feel I'm good enough. So at the end, you'll just see a sorting. It could be that you just see a sorting of firms into exporters and non-exporters based on the better guys just start exporting. It doesn't have to go because I'm exporting, am I getting more productive? Or am I exporting because I'm better? I mean, that's the key distinction. And it's a crucial one, because how much can, whether we increase trade, how much is that going to impact productivity, crucially hinges on some sort of answer to this. And this has been a major stumbling block in this literature for a longest time. I mean, we still don't have, but I think there is one new study which is it's going to come out in a journal, any day now, in this quarterly journal of economics. There's a study by these three economists called David Atkins, Amit Khandelwal, and Osman, who conducted this fascinating randomized trial in Egypt. And so what was their randomized trial? So they took a pool of small Egyptian rug makers. Okay? These guys had no previous export experience. They pretty much had all similar productivity levels. And then a fraction of them were given export contracts. That was the treatment group, if you will. They were treated, they were just given export contracts with all the standard clauses that go with export contracts about meeting quality targets, about when will their export packages be accepted, what markers do they have to meet, etc., etc. And what they found was they tracked these guys over the next few years, and with a lot of different tests, they established two key things. First is, before trade, that's how these firms were selected, that there was no productivity difference. But then what happens is that the guys who were given the exporting contracts, their productivity levels shoot up. Second, then they try to tease out that is it because they're choosing a different composition, because sometimes trade requires them to produce certain specific kinds of goods. So maybe they're just choosing to produce things which have more higher value, etc. But no, then they asked these guys to produce the same good. That was a very, very clearly, so non-exporters and exporters were both asked at the end of the trial to produce the same rug with the same specifications. And what you found was that the exporting firms were an order of magnitude more productive than the non-productive firms. And so they essentially call that the learning by exporting channel, that you get better and you learn how to do things better in the process of exporting. So the gains from trade can be large. So that's what is at stake. I mean, if you will, what is at stake, that's what's at stake. So what has happened over time is that, there has always been this traditional, mainstream view that there are these aggregate gains from trade. I think there is, that is the line that has been peddled for, the longest time, that trade is beneficial because there are these aggregate gains. What has also been known for equally long is that those aggregate gains go hand in hand with micro-level redistributions. Okay? There are losers. Not everybody gains the same way. Some forces get displaced, others expand. So that too has been known for the longest time, except that for some reason that hasn't been emphasized enough, or that somehow got lost in this, we got all sucked into this attraction of these aggregate gains, that these micro-level dispersions or redistributions didn't get enough focus. So now, of course, after the last 30, 35 years of increasing globalization, it's become more and more clear that there have been some very clear winners, and this is true globally. The winners have been the large corporations. The winners have been the white-collar workers. The winners have been the owners of capital, more broadly defined. And there have been some well-defined groups that have lost. And those tend to be, in developed countries, they've attracted a lot of attention. These are blue-collar workers, mostly who are, with manufacturing-linked businesses in cities. Those are the places that have really lost out. And that has started this massive pushback or debate that has taken off. So I think it's important to, for everybody to do a mea culpa in some sense, that policymakers and economists in equal measure, chaos theorists or not, I think have oversold the gains from, I think Sanjeev's left the building, but it's chaotic outside too, but anyway, so policymakers and economists have clearly oversold the gains, and we've emphasized aggregate gains and completely ignored, or to at least a first approximation, we've ignored the underlying, micro losses. And the micro stuff just stayed almost theoretical, that, yeah, you can compensate people who are losing. But, nobody actually sat down and came up with fiscal schemes, redistribution schemes that would actually do this. And in fact, we went the opposite way of fiscal retrenchment, fiscal consolidation, which was all going about, trying to pare back spending, trying to keep government budgets all in alignment so that, we didn't run deficits, etc. So that whole movement went hand in hand with this explosion of trade. So it became a bit of a double whammy. And now we are at this point where we risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater because of this pushback, and that's where we are. So parsing the trade pushback, there are two broad, themes that, recur over and over again. There are these two issues that the U.S., threats to international agreements, which is threatening international agreements. And at the same time, you've got these Brexit tensions all over, and not just Brexit, but EU in general. There are these tensions and pushbacks that are going on. Now, I'm going to claim that these two things should not be conflated. They are sort of subtly but significantly different. They are distinct. Because the source of the tensions that govern all the debate that's going on in the US is significantly different from the source of the debate that I think is driving a lot of the action, a lot of the pushback within Europe. Brexit and EU tensions have a lot to do with migration and labor flows, because that has brought this whole thing up. And you talk to anybody within Europe, and a lot of the complaints are, about the fact that in Brexit, in Britain, for example, they're just all complaining about the fact that the plumbing jobs are going to East Europeans. So it's all about labor flows that are driving out, and that has caused the pushback about trying to exit from that. So it's not so much about trade and goods, and that indeed is the soft Brexit that they're trying to negotiate, is trying to keep somehow the trading arrangement going, but somehow keep the pushback on this labor flow. That has been the major issue. So it's clearly a bit different. The US, on the other hand, the pushback has a lot to do with two things. One is very Trump-specific. He has had a 30-year antipathy for trade agreements. And that is almost the only thing he's been consistent on. If you at least track all his known statements. So he's got this very, very long-running, dislike for trade agreements. At the same time, there has been another big group within fairly conservative, establishment ranks in the US, who have had increasing concerns about China. What has happened now is that these two forces have come together, because there is somebody running the show, and he's surrounded himself with these hawks who have had all these concerns about China. The increasing integration of China has gone hand in hand with China, and there's this perception it has not played by the standard rules. It has ring-fenced industries, it has ring-fenced capital flows, it has sort of imposed technological transfers on people who are coming in. So it has created this thing about that China has not played by the rules. And so the US pushback and the European pushback are distinct. They're different, and it's important to keep that in mind if we are going to think about where might this go. This is going to be a very important distinction to keep in mind as to where this might go. So, in my view, the structure of US trade with China will likely change in a very fundamental way. China is viewed not just as a trading partner, but as a strategic competitor. I mean, that's globally going forward. That is the view of China that the US has. That this is a competitor going forward in a security sense, in a economic power sense, in a political power sense. In every sense of the word, China is a competitor. So, this engagement that has happened with China, with all this outsourced supply chains that are somehow linked through China, with its all kinds of security implications, whether it's about data, whether it's about technological interface with China, is all linked in this pushback. And that's where the U.S., I think, is going to, doesn't matter what the administration is, whether it's Trump's, Trump will come and go. I mean, that he'll be gone in maximum another 7 years, or maybe in a shorter time, or actually less. I mean, six or 2. But this aspect is not going to go away. So there will be a change in the way this whole global supply chain is organized. The U.S. trade frictions with the rest of the world, in terms of tearing up NAFTA and not wanting to sign the TPP, or withdrawing from the TPP and saying I'm going to revisit the WTO itself, all of those things I think are much more Trump specific. There are aspects about global trade regulation that I think will be renegotiated. I mean, I think there has been this internal debate within the U.S. about how much they want to hand over decisions about trade disputes to a WTO panel of judges. So there's been, I mean, somehow that was like a massive gift that suddenly the rest of the world got from the US. So somebody suddenly agreed to do this in the mid-'80s, and that's what changed this whole system. But a huge, a significant chunk of people in the US in administrative positions have disliked it for the longest time, because they think that we've lost control over the process. In other words, I would really like to, I've gone slapped, I'd really like to slap back, but I'm not being allowed to do so. And that has been a major, I'm too big a guy to be, just taking this punishment in an open forum. And so it has, there's been a long, and the current, trade czar in the US is exactly from that era. Of course, these guys have somehow forgotten all the bad things that happened, starting 1930 when the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were put in. And that seemingly, led to, this tit-for-tat tariffs and until the Second World War hit. I mean, we were just careening downwards. So that history somehow has been forgotten. And this, dispute resolution mechanism was a way of avoiding that tit-for-tat tariff ratchet effect. But this regime is pretty strong. So, I mean, I think there will be a change in the way regulation is done. I mean, there is no getting away from that. But it is not the case, I think, that multilateral trading arrangements are just going to start getting torn up. That's a much more Trump-specific thing that's happening. And some of it is posture, and some of it is Trump-specific. But I think that's going to be gone once he's gone. But this China thing is here to stay, because there is a widespread view that this has to, something we need to reorganize the way we think. The European Union frictions, on the other hand, are likely to stabilize much faster once they figure out what the labor flow, migration flows, how to control that. I think that there is much more, consensus about goods trade within China than elsewhere. So what's the likely way forward? I think there's a three-part process. We're going to see increases in a continued process of these preferential trade agreements that people have been signing. I think that process, is that train is, has not been derailed. We're still going to see that. Maybe the way in which some agreements are struck is going to change a bit, but I don't see, a big rollback in that. There will be changes in the regulatory framework of international trade. I mean, that is for sure. And more so because a bunch of other things are getting caught up. How do you protect data? How do you protect? Because, I mean, in this day and age of big data, who owns the data becomes a fundamental component of who can innovate, who can provide products in real time, is a function of who owns the data. So data security is going to become, how do you regulate that? Intellectual property rights, how do you regulate that? So there's going to be fundamental changes in the way regulation is done. I think that there is no getting away from that. And lastly, as I said, there's going to be a lot more alignment of trade agreements with strategic security considerations. I mean, that is going to be the way I think a lot of bilateral, tripartite kinds of trading arrangements might be done, keeping in mind regional or strategic security considerations. And lastly, there will be internal fiscal redistribution schemes that are going to have to be brought to the table because that's just a political demand. Within all these places, there is a huge political demand for this stuff, so there is no getting around people somehow provisioning for greater welfare, welfare programs, retraining programs. There will be these, whether it's minimum income policies or not, even people are even talking about those. So there will be a systematic, fiscal redistribution.
Thank you for that.
So I have 2 more slides. Can I just? I thought I hadn't finished my 20 minutes. I'm.
So did I.
Yeah. So I think I just want to talk about the outlook for India which is my last bit. So I think the strategic reorientation that I think should be happening. I mean, in terms of the U.S. reorienting away from China, provides India with an opportunity. Because the US corporates will have to reorient supply chains away from China, in particular the non-Starbucks guys. Starbucks I don't think will worry too much, but the Ciscos and the Qualcomms, these guys are all going to be worrying about what to do. So insourcing back to the US may be just too expensive and not feasible due to cost. So I think this provides an opportunity for India. And this is one of the reasons why you see China trying to reach out to India, because they want to somewhat firewall this whole thing. Because if there is going to be a reorientation, India provides a logical first place to at least look, for multiple reasons. There's a huge domestic market. There's a diverse economy that could potentially feed diverse different kinds of supply chains. And there's a huge labor force, which is still cheap. But it comes with the usual caveats of all things India, which is we need, for people to come in and invest significant chunks of money, we need land and labor reforms that's going to allow these guys to operate at scale, which is important. We have to make the business of doing business a whole lot easier. And human resource management, in particular skill building, it has to be fundamental focus of policy making. So in conclusion, I think I'll just say that, this may not be all bad from an Indian perspective. I think there's maybe an opportunity for India that presents itself, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Mr. Ravi? Yeah.
Thank you, sir, and good afternoon to all friends who have gathered. First of all, I must apologize. I don't have a formal presentation to make. I've been told by my boss to fill in at the last minute. So I just came, and I'll share my random thoughts on how we look at the G20 process, and then probably we'll take some questions to answer. First of all, the reason for G20 coming into being is the underlying feeling at that time in 2008 was that rich countries alone cannot fix problems of the global problems, particularly the financial crisis. So then you expanded the body from G7, G8 plus, then became G20. When you look at the G20 also, you will see that this is largely a composition with a lot of contradictions. Why? Because you have a large number of developed countries, you have few emerging economies, and a large number of developing countries outside this sphere. There's no representation of a large number of LDCs in this body. So whenever you take a decision, perhaps you tend to look at it from the angle or a perspective of developed countries, and then you try and come out with certain kind of ideas or views which then get captured in the multilateral institutions. So we need to be very careful how you strike a balance in the G20 negotiations and deliberations. The other contradiction that I see in G20 is that most of the time you have an agenda to discuss, but you have no enforcement mechanism in the G20. So a lot of it is a talk, and some of the ideas do get captured in the WTO processes or the multilateral institutions, but there is no binding commitments for the G20 member countries themselves. But notwithstanding, we see that there is true value to be engaged in the G20. It's a very important body because of the fact that 2/3 of the world population is represented there. 85% of the world GDP is part of that. So it's a very important body to dialogue and deliberate on emerging issues or new issues of the trade and investment, on many other issues. There are several tracks in G20, so a lot of ongoing discussions take place. Currently, what are the challenges? Coming from the G20 Trade Ministers meeting in Argentina recently, I can say for sure that there are few issues on which the G20 is really concerned about. One is the protectionism, the unilateral measures, and the trade tensions. And then